Hi and welcome back to the channel. It's time to do more bingeable cult television viewing. And I've got a list of 6 different things for you to check out if you haven't already. And if you have seen them in the past, it might be time to revisit some of these ones because they are fun. Some of them are deep cuts you might not have heard of before and some of them are familiar. But let's start with something fairly recent from 2008. It's a TV series so deeply layered in pop culture references that it will blow your mind if you haven't seen it. And it is, he said, reaching behind him, The Middleman. Now, The Middleman is an interesting series. It stars Mantis and Natalie Morales. It was created by Javier Grillo-Marxuach, and it is a lot of fun.
Thank you for calling A&D Laboratories. I'm connecting your call.
Mad scientists and aliens and androids and monsters.
Ready to puncture some puppet heart?
So the devil actually does wear Prada.
The Wuhan thumb of death.
Trippy.
Natalie Morales stars as Wendy Watson, who is kind of in the gig economy. She's an artist, but she's temping in various temp agencies until she comes up against the Jolly Fats Weehawken temp employment agency run by the Middleman, played by Matt Kiesler. And they are basically a secret organization that handles exotic threats. And in the 7 or so episodes of The Middleman, they have some pretty exotic threats. There's a Chinese terracotta warrior that's trying to kill the last emperor of China. There's hyper-intelligent apes who have a fetish for Martin Scorsese movies. There are zombies and all sorts of other weird and wonderful threats, some of which are magical, some of which are scientific, but all of which are incredibly funny. Each episode of this series has some incredible deep cut pop culture references. The very name of the employment agency, the Jolly Fats Weehawken Employment Agency, is an obscure reference to an airline in a Jerry Lewis movie. And they have kind of themes in each episode where all of the references are about one thing. There's one episode where all the references are about Frank Herbert and Dune. But this episode has nothing at all to do with Frank Herbert and Dune. But if you listen very closely to the dialogue, there are all sorts of little Easter eggs in there about that particular book series. It's a little hard to describe Middleman, but it only went one season, it only went about 8 or 9 episodes. But it's well worth checking out. It was on ABC Family Network in America. And I think in some ways it was much too hip for the room. It was originally based on a comic strip from Viper Comics. And a comic was done for the final episode, which was never broadcast or produced. It has a craziness about it that I really love. We also have Mary Pat Gleason as Ida, a robot from outer space that's trapped in a mode of being an angry librarian. And she's a lot of fun in there too. There's just a hipness to it, a coolness about it. There's references to all sorts of really odd things like Bob Baedeker westerns and other pop cultural things. There are comic references, there are movie references, there are musical references. It's just wall-to-wall Easter eggs. And a lot of fun for that. But unfortunately it wasn't successful. And it's a little bit of a shame because I would have been happy with 2 or 3 seasons of it. It's one of those series, I think, that if it had come out maybe 5 or 6 years later and been on Netflix or one of those other platforms that wasn't quite there yet in 2008, it would have been really successful and it would have been much better known than it is. You can find the DVDs off it if you look around on eBay and places like that. I think I'm paying about $25 Australian to get it, but it's worth it for me because I'm, as you know, a fan of these kind of weird, obscure TV series that aren't exactly successful but are a lot of fun. And Middleman is definitely one of those. You should really check it out if you haven't already. And if you have checked it out already, you checked it out 12 years ago. So it might be time to do a revisit on this one. The next series from 1994-1995, it was based on a pilot movie which was quite successful. It was produced by Sam Raimi and Sam Hamm. And then it went to series, but the series unfortunately didn't rate very well, and so it died after 1 season. Nonetheless, it's a precursor to some other things that came later. And on its own, it's kind of interesting. The special effects are very 1990s television series, but this one I kind of like, and it is Mantis. Now, this is the Steelbook edition of the series from Mad Men here in Australia. And it stars Carl Lumley as a scientist, Miles Hawkins, who has been injured in a police shooting and has become a paraplegic. He's kind of like a black Tony Stark in a sense. Now, because he hasn't settled for being disabled, he creates an exoskeleton along with his friend John Stonebreak, played by Roger Rees, which enables him to walk and move around and regain his mobility. And this exoskeleton also gives him enhanced strength, enhanced agility, and the fabric of the bodysuit that the exoskeleton is attached to is bulletproof. So he decides to become a vigilante superhero, as you do. He's got a kind of bat plane-like vehicle, which always helps in getting around. And the series is kind of cool in that mid-90s way. They also have a sidekick played by Chris Garton, who is a bicycle courier, so they've got that kind of 90s edginess about them. The series wasn't tremendously expensive to make, so the budget wasn't great. It was filmed in Canada, as a lot of these series are. And I kind of like it too. The original telemovie was a lot stronger than the series ended up being. It was about police corruption and racism in the police and conspiracies of wealthy white men and things like that. But the series itself kind of watered that down a little bit. And they lost most of the cast except for Carl Lumley. Having said that, it's kind of fun to watch. It's not quite Batman, and it's a little bit of a precursor in some ways to series like Black Lightning, which came much later, in that it has an African-American star. It does have representation in it, and it's not necessarily authoritarian. Now, the series wasn't rating very well, so about halfway through the first season, they pivoted the series and started throwing in a whole bunch of science fiction aspects like time travel and alternate universes and monsters and other things like that. But it didn't really save the series, and it ends up on a bit of a cliffhanger with the time travel aspect, which I'm not going to spoil for you. Watch the series. It's not the best series ever, but it's interesting, and it's nice to see the things that kind of are precursors to other series that came later, the ones that kind of blaze the trail for subsequent series. And I like Carl Lumley as an actor. I like the 90s feel of it, the 90s clothes, the 90s synth music, and in some cases the 1990s attitude to things. But Mantis is kind of a soft recommend for me. If you're interested in superhero movies and kind of movies that aren't Batman but are kind of blazing as a bit of a similar trail, it's worth checking out. And yeah, I watched about 4 or 5 episodes of it the other day, and they were fun to watch, but I can see where the limitations are, and I can see where maybe the suits interfered a bit with the process of making the series, and in doing so, as often happens, weakening it. But it's worth checking out, and it's worth having a copy of. I don't normally collect steel books, but this one's kind of fun. I don't need my physical media to be bullet resistant, but you really should check out Mantis if you get an opportunity to. It's worth your time. The next one's a British series that broadcast from 1979 to 1982. It's a cult favourite with a lot of people who remember it from when it first came out, and it's got some stars that are fairly well known. Again, it's got a very kind of tight budget. It was filmed in quite kind of tense circumstances in some ways because of that budget and because of the limitations, and it was scheduled really oddly at the time, coming out only occasionally and with no real regular schedule. And the episodes were kind of limited as well by the fact that they did a bit of a recap of previous episodes at the beginning of each episode. So rewatching it on DVD is a bit of an ask, because you've got to kind of fast forward through the recaps every time you watch an episode of it. But people like it, and I watched the first of the, I think, 6 stories, and it's better than I thought it was going to be. And it is Sapphire and Steel, starring David McCallum and Joanna Lumley as 2 operatives who protect the integrity of the Corridor of Time. Now, the Corridor of Time is a bit of a weird concept, but there are things that can weaken it. In the first story, it is the fact that there are a lot of clocks in the house and that the house is very old, and that enables entities from outside the Corridor of Time to exploit weaknesses in the fabric in these kind of places and enter the house. They enter the house and kidnap the parents of 2 children, and Sapphire and Steel are brought along to try to unwind and destroy the entities that are messing with the house, and also capturing people and moving them through time in a way that they obviously don't want them to do. Now, David McCallum and Joanna Lumley are quite good in the series. I think it's kind of, the characters are underwritten. There's a mystery about them. We learn a bit more about them in subsequent episodes, but they are considered elements. So there are about 120 elements in the universe of Sapphire and Steel, even though neither Sapphire nor Steel are on the elementary periodic table. They do get help from another one of the elements, Lead, played by American actor Val Pringle, who's really lifts the episode that I watched. He's kind of cheerful and avuncular and happy and very, very strong. He takes away some of the serious and the self-importance of the series a little bit and lifts it up a little, just that little bit higher. The child actors are very much kind of standard 1970s, 1980s English child actors, in that they don't talk like kids normally talk, and they, in some cases, aren't very good. But you can kind of see the older actors pushing them along and lifting them along and encouraging them in subtle ways, which makes it a little more interesting. The special effects are very rudimentary, but they do the best they can with them. And it's kind of roughly in the same sort of genre as Doctor Who was at that stage, but with a very much more serious feel about it. But a lot of people like Sapphire and Steel. I'm kind of on the fence about it a little bit. I think that it's one of those series where they really needed to have a stronger Bible for it. They really needed to nail down the mythology and the world of the series much better than they did. Maybe seeing what happens when Sapphire and Steel are recruited for something, giving a little bit of background to them would have been helpful. But it's kind of fun revisiting these ones, and picking them apart can be a very kind of interesting thing to do, in the sense that you can see where certain series work and certain series don't. And while you're still enjoying it, it's sometimes educational in our knowledge as consumers of media to know what the difference between good and bad is. And Sapphire and Steel does have its virtues, but I don't think that it was entirely there. Maybe they needed a decent script doctor or a showrunner to carry it through, but I know the budgets were very, very limited, and that of course limits the availability of certain people to resource it. Now, there are 2 versions of this came out on DVD. There's this one, which has got the whole series and is the recommended one, and there was another one where they kind of did that thing where they put out the first 3 episodes, and then in a different, you pay for the next 3 episodes, and then the third 3 as a way of getting more money out of the buyers. It's always good to get a box set of a whole series, not just have to buy 3 box sets to get a series. I think that business model's pretty much ended now, and everything is coming out in box sets of whole series. But I remember about 10 or 15 years ago when DVDs were first coming out, it really pissed me off that things were coming out in part 1, part 2 and part 3 of a series. And it's good to see that things are changing with that. Sapphire and Steel, if you liked it when you watched it originally, you'll probably like it, but it may be a little more of a steep climb for people who aren't familiar with the series. Let's go to something that everybody knows about and everybody loves. It's from the 1970s. It's American. There were 2 television movies that were very, very successful, made before the series came out, and it is the wonderful Monster of the Week series, Check the Night Stalker, with Darren McGavin and Simon Oakland in it. It started out as an unpublished novel by a guy called Jeff Rice, and I've read the novel, and to be honest with you, the novel of the Night Stalker is not very good. But fortunately, when the television network, I think it was ABC in America, got the rights to it, they got Richard Matheson to write the scripts for first The Night Stalker as a television movie, and then The Night Strangler, when The Night Stalker proved to be a very successful television movie. Now, Richard Matheson, he created The Incredible Shrinking Man, he created I Am Legend, and all of the versions of that have come out, including the Omega Man. Really fine fantasy writer and slightly underestimated in the pantheon of fantasy writers. But after the 2 television movies came out, they went to series, and Darren McGavin's Carl Kolchak is an iconic journalist, investigator, monster hunter. And he's idealistic, he's cynical, he's bombastic, he's just such a lot of fun to spend time with as a character. So many people love Darren McGavin for this. He'd been doing TV series in America for a very long time. In 1955, he was the pusher in Frank Sinatra's movie The Man with the Golden Arm. If you want to see him do a dramatic turn, he is fantastic in that. He did a TV series called Riverboat in the late 1950s. He did a Mike Hammer TV series in the late 1950s. He did a couple of other series after that and a lot of television movies with occasional movie roles. But for the most part, he was mostly known as a television actor, but he was a fine thespian. He could pretty much play any kind of role. And in creating Kolchak, you've got to give the guy props for this, because he really makes the character live. And he's probably one of the iconic genre television series characters whom we all love. Now, they did a bit of a Monster of the Week of this. They had vampires, they had mummies, they had a headless motorcycle guy, they had robots. They kind of ran through pretty much every monster they could think of in that first series, and didn't go to a second series, which is a shame, because it would have been nice to see him doing some more varied monsters. And there were monsters from all over the world they could have done. They could have done some yokai, they could have done some Filipino aswangs, they could have really taken it to other places had they the resources to do so. But at the time in 1970s television, genre television was very much a kind of poor cousin to the mainstream dramas and comedies and things like that. It wasn't as well respected as it is now, and for that reason it's a bit of a hidden gem and a cult favorite. They did do a kind of reboot of it, I think in the late 1990s, early 2000s. I'll put up here when they did it, which just didn't work at all. It was really PPO, piss poor and ordinary. And you've really got to go back to this one, because the writing was crisp, the character was well defined, and the world of the series, where the existence of monsters isn't hidden by great vast conspiracies. It's hidden by the fact that politicians and local law enforcement just want to shove everything under a carpet. And that kind of makes more sense in a way. Things are supernatural, things are hidden because they're just not something that the authorities want to deal with. And I like that approach. It kind of makes sense in the world of realpolitik in some ways. But Kolchak the Night Stalker is definitely a favourite. I'm going to re-watch the series, but I'm waiting to get the Blu-rays of Night Stalker and Night Strangler, which I have on order at the moment. When I get those, I'm going to binge the whole lot and just spend a lot of really enjoyable hours with Carl Kolchak and his quest to find out the truth about the nature of the world. Now, the final two are deep cuts. Now, there's one which is non-English language but is crazy AF. It is fun. It was kind of a response to Star Trek. It's from Germany, and it is Space Patrol Orion. If you haven't heard of this one, you should. Visually, it's a stunning piece of science fiction television. The universe it creates is crazy as hell. It's weird and wonderful. It's got a unique look about it. It was made in black and white. They only ever made 7 episodes of it. But in Germany and other European countries, it's really a cult favorite. It's the story of the crew of the spaceship Orion. And there's a running gag through this series that they keep destroying the ship to save the day. And so they get a new ship each time they go out on patrol. The ship runs out of an underwater base in the Gulf of Carpentaria, north of Australia, which is probably one of the worst places to have an underwater base because the sea is incredibly shallow there. But they do it. It's got a weird look about it. The budgets, again, were very low. And so they did some really weird things. They used household items to make the consoles. They used washing machine parts and electric irons, and some of the light fittings were made out of plastic cups. They really gave this series a unique look. And they also did some smart stuff by using designer furniture, cutting-edge designer furniture from Europe in the 1960s for the furniture in the series. So it's got a really groovy look about it. The actors are strong, and there's a bit of female representation in there. Some of the crew are female, and they're seen to be equal to the men, which is a nice little thing. And there's also a fantastic soundtrack by the go-to guy for 1960s genre works in Germany at the time, Peter Thomas, who did the music for things like the Jerry Cotton detective movie series with George Nader in it, and a whole bunch of the crimi movies of the 1960s. But Space Patrol Orion is a real recommend. You can get through them pretty fast, but the patrol basically is going up against a bunch of aliens called the Frogs, who are technologically more advanced than humans and want to destroy humanity. That's basically all you need to know about the series. But you should really check this one out because it's worth having fun with, and just visually it's beautifully done, even if the visuals at times are pretty crazy. So if you haven't checked out Space Patrol Orion, give it a go. Now we're moving on to the last one, which is a mini-series. Cyberpunk on American television in particular was never well done back in the 1990s when it was a thing. But there was one high note. It was based on a comic written by a guy called Bruce Wagner, who did a really great novel about Hollywood called Force Majeure, which you should read if you get a chance. And in 1993, they did a mini-series of it, with one of the episodes directed by future Academy Award winner Catherine Bigelow. It's got James Belushi, Robert Loggia, Angie Dickinson, Dana Delaney, and Nick Mancuso in it, and it is Wild Palms. Now, if you haven't seen Wild Palms, it's a really great cyberpunk series, and it has a stamp of authenticity because there's a cameo by William Gibson as William Gibson in the series. He does a walk-on. He apparently knows one of the characters in this. It's a weird and wonderful and very forward-looking series. It's set in the year 2007, and remember this was made in 1993, after an economic collapse in America, and things have just got worse. There's a lot of Japanese influence in American culture, and two different groups of people are vying for control of the country. The fathers, who are very much a conservative group and control politics and the media, and the friends, who are very much more about civil liberties and things like that. There's a cult church called the Church of Synthetiotics, run by Tony Kreutzer, an American senator played by Robert Loggia, which is very much a parallel for the Church of Scientology. Kreutzer is dying, and he wants to get hold of what's called a Go chip so he can upload his consciousness into the computer network of the world. James Belushi plays a character called Harry Wyckoff, who gets involved with the fathers and the friends and has a family history with both of those groups. His wife, played by Dana Delaney, gets involved as well, and an ex-girlfriend of his, Paige Katz, played by Kim Cattrall, is part of the Church of Synthetiotics and gets involved with Harry again. Reality breaks down a lot of ways. It's got a very Philip K. Dick feel to it in some ways. It's also got some other great actors in it, like Brad Dourif's in it. You've also got Robert Morse. Just a whole bunch of really good character actors showing up and doing little pieces in it. It's very much a very different kind of miniseries for American television at the time, and a lot of people found it confusing because it really needed you to lean into understanding the world and watching closely. It's a miniseries that really does demand that you pay attention to it while you're watching it and just kind of get into the world of it. It's got some really interesting use of popular music, as well as having a very kind of tonal soundtrack of its own by Ryuichi Sakamoto, which is really very much a different kind of thing for this particular time and place and this particular format. It was so confusing, in fact, that there was actually a book put out as a support book to the series, and it is the Wild Palms Reader, which I happen to have a copy of. It's quite hard to get hold of these days, I'm told, but it does flesh out the world. It's got some essays about the series, and it's got a very interesting visual look to the pages, while it does flesh out the creation of it. And also it's got some essays about cyberpunk and other things in this. So Wild Palms people don't remember very much, but I think that it's quite an important miniseries in the fact that it just showed that turn where American television in particular was really starting to take science fiction seriously as a genre. And you've got to respect it for that reason. It is a lot of fun now. In Australia it was released on DVD. I'm not sure about in other markets, but I looked around on eBay and there are some copies of the whole series available at a pretty good price. And if you, like me, enjoy kind of quirky TV series, you should really check out Wild Palms. It's a mind-blowingly interesting little effort. And one of the things I find fascinating is the way that past years saw the future and what they thought the future would be. And particularly in things like the clothing design and the production design. This gives us a very well thought out world. The world building is really top rate for this kind of stuff in here. And of course, because it's a cyberpunk 1990s kind of series, it does have virtual reality in it at a very high level. And that's one of the main driving engines. It's not just tacked onto the series, it's very much part of the plot structure, the virtual reality aspects of it. So you should check out Wild Palms if you haven't already. And I'm going to revisit that one too. I think I may spend some time on the couch watching Night Stalker and Wild Palms again when I get a little bit of an opportunity, and probably give myself hemorrhoids. But anyway, before we go, there's one more thing too. When I did the celebration of getting 1,000 subscribers, I left somebody out in my thanks. And that is my wife Sally, who's also known as Middle Aged Geek Girl. She does a crafting channel on YouTube, and she has been as supportive as I could wish. It's a weird thing being the partner of a YouTuber. I know that, and she knows that. And you've really got to kind of cut people some slack so they've got the time to do what they need to do for a channel. And she has been immensely supportive, and I apologize to her publicly for forgetting to mention her in that video. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and liking the video. As usual, please look after yourself. Wear a mask, wear it over your nose. Watch some good TV, watch some bad TV, watch some quirky hidden gem TV, because it's always a bit of fun to do that. And I'll catch you next time.